It's all perspective, David, and I read your book, Take Action. I read it twice, and I know you understand this. It's all perspective, and growing up looking radically different than everybody else. Let me just share something with you that I'm writing a book and I'm researching it and I'm living this and I'm trying to figure out. So I'm in Dallas, for example. Well, let me just start over. I get people screaming at me. People scream at me in public when they see me the first time, literally scream in fear. I've got people every year come up and say, if I look like you, I'd kill myself. I was sitting out in front of a 7-Eleven drinking a soda, and some woman came up and threw her change in my cup. I've been denied countless jobs because people flat out tell me I can't hire somebody who looks like you. When I was younger, it's a rough path, and I was always curious why. And everybody's gonna say, "Well, have you looked in the mirror, Kip?" It's obvious why, but I wanted to go a little deeper, so I researched the heck out of it. What I learned was this: there were these biologists on the Serengeti studying wildebeest migration patterns. Now, bear with me here. Stick with me here, okay? They're studying
All
these
right.
wildebeest.
We just went from people screaming in the street to wildebeest in the Serengeti, but I'm
Yeah,
with you.
so they're studying migration patterns. Well, all the wildebeest look the same, and there's 500 in a herd. And to study migration patterns, they obviously need to look at one and study what one or two or individual specimens are doing. Well, they're out there in the back of the pickup truck or in a blind or whatever, and they're watching this wildebeest. We're going to call her Sue. And the wife calls, they reach for their coffee, they look down, they look away, they look back up, and they can't reacquire Sue. They can't find where she went in the herd of all the other wildebeest. And so they came up with a brilliant idea. They went out and caught a half a dozen wildebeest and they painted their horns white. And they figured, well, we'll be able to see them now, right? And what they actually saw was the ones that they painted their horns white were the next half a dozen that were killed. Okay. And what they learned in that was, we were taught when we were kids that the lion takes the old, the sick, or the stupid. The predator culls the herd and cleanses the gene pool by killing the ones that are vulnerable. And that's not true. The predator kills the ones who look different. Okay. And so suddenly the fact that I'm treated so differently because I've got jacked up arms, suddenly it starts to make sense on a completely different level. And then a biologist named Robert Sapolsky replicated it with zebras. And then they did it with fish. They did it with birds. They did it with insects. They did it all across the animal kingdom. And we have the same exact visual tracking software. We focus on the oddity. Okay. And so that's why I'm stared at everywhere I go. Staring is a sign of aggression in mammals. And suddenly the way I'm treated is starting to make sense. Okay.
Right.
But it
Right.
didn't make it any easier. It got easier one day when, I couldn't get a job when I was younger. I'm 21 years old. I'm unemployed. I can't get a job. Nobody will hire me. And they'll look me right in the face and say, I can't hire somebody who looks like you. I went into a restaurant to try to get a job. They said, I can't have people, see you near their food. You can't work here. It was a really difficult time. I finally got a job as a bicycle messenger in Miami. And I got that job because it was a blind hire. I responded to an ad in the newspaper, talked to them on the phone. They said, go to this mailbox in the downtown building. Here's the code. Pull out your pager and your shirt. You're hired. So I was a bicycle messenger in downtown Miami. That was the only job I could get. And one day I had a delivery and I went into a building. And I got to tell you something, I'm 21 years old and I'm flat out suicidal. I'm drinking too much. I can't get a date to save my life. I can't get a job that I want. I'm broke. I'm living on top of a restaurant. I'm still going to school, but it was an extremely difficult time, and I was flat out suicidal. And I honestly considered very, very frequently just turning my bike handlebars and eating a bus and ending it. And then I get this delivery, and I go into this building, and I get on an elevator. And just as the elevator doors are closing, this little hand comes through the opening, and a woman gets on. And she turned sideways in the elevator instead of, her back to me. I was in the back of the elevator. She turned sideways, and mammals can tell when they're being stared at, and I can tell when I'm being stared at. And she was staring at me. And I'm digging through my bag to get my delivery and my receipt book, and I just look up at her. And usually people will look away, but she didn't. She just stood there and she smiled. And then all she did next was save my life, man. She said 7 words. She said, "I bet you lead an interesting life." And it wasn't a question. It was more of a statement. And I didn't say anything back. I just kind of shrugged and went back to digging through my bag. And then the bell rang and she got off the elevator and she was gone. And I never saw her again. But I'm on this elevator and I'm mulling that in my mind. I bet you lead an interesting life. I bet you lead an interesting life. And then by the time I made my delivery and got back down to the ground, I was crying uncontrollably. Because in 20 seconds, in 15 seconds, my entire perspective on my circumstances changed completely. See, I used to define my circumstances as painful, as this sucks. This is awful. I'm disabled and everybody knows it. I can't hide it. I'm never, no matter what I do in this life, my life is going to suck. I'll never have a girlfriend. I'll never get married. I'll never have kids. I'll never have meaningful work. I mean, this is pain. This is really bad. Then I get on this elevator and the woman pretty much just gave me permission to consider it interesting as opposed to painful. And David, everything changed in 20 seconds because I'm sitting out front of this building crying uncontrollably next to my bike. And I stand up and I realize that I define my circumstances. Viktor Frankl went through the same thing in the concentration camp, right? Shakespeare talks about it. He says, there is no good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's in the Bible, it's in the Quran, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they all say the same thing, that we determine what our circumstances mean. We can't change what happens to us in our lives, but we absolutely determine what it means to us. And so I changed my entire focus from pain to, gosh, this is interesting. And suddenly, interesting is an emotionally neutral word, right?
Yes.
And everything changed. I spent the next 3-4 weeks on my bike riding through the streets of Miami with this huge grin on my face, realizing that I gotten my life back. And, the sun, everything changed color. I could taste again. Everything changed at the deepest level. And man, I never looked back. I went into my next job interview and I said, "Hey, I look different, but there's nothing I can do that you can do that I can't. I'm 100% functional. Give me a shot." And I started getting jobs, and I literally asked out the next 3,000 women I saw, and I started getting dates. And if they said no to me, it didn't hurt anymore because it wasn't painful. It was interesting. And so a woman would say no to me, and I would say, "You sure about that? Why?" I had fun with it, and I was no longer an emotional wreck. And everything in my life changed. And it was so powerful that I actually kept it a secret. I didn't talk about it. I was married 10 years before I told my wife about that woman in the elevator. I was 50 before I told my brothers about that woman in the elevator. I never talked about it because I honestly thought that, maybe I'm crazy because, being like this is supposed to suck and suddenly it doesn't. Suddenly it's kind of cool. Suddenly it's really interesting. Suddenly I can have a lot of fun with it. And I'm thinking to myself, that can't be good. You know what I mean?
I gotta ask you, how did you recognize that moment? Because those moments can happen time and time again before they're recognized. And so how did you go from drinking too much, being suicidal, being angry, being upset, being sad, feeling different, feeling disabled, feeling hurt? People would scream at you on the street, like out of fear. You couldn't get jobs, you couldn't get dates, you couldn't get all these things. How did you go from all of that pain, that association to pain, to recognizing that one moment? Like, what do you believe it was that helped you identify that moment?
I'd like to take credit for it, but I can't. I think 2 things happened. I was in so much pain, I can't even describe it.
I can imagine. I can only imagine.
And the point I'm making is, people avoid pain, they avoid challenge, they avoid difficulty. Our entire Western culture is predicated on this idea that you can avoid adversity. No, you can't. Life is
Yeah.
pain, right? And you
Yeah.
can spend your life, you can spend your life avoiding it, or you can, embrace the suck, as they say, and power through. And I'm standing on that elevator and I'm so desperate, I'm so low, I'm so hurt that when that came out of her mouth, I think it was like her throwing a life ring. I was so low that I just anything was going to work. But the other half of it was, other than being so desperate that, they say that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Well, brother, I was ready. Okay. And there she was. And she said 7 words and I was done. But the other half of it, I've studied this ever since, and it's absolutely fascinating. Here's what's really cool about it. The science hadn't caught up. So as soon as the internet comes out, I'm all over it trying to figure out what the heck happened in that elevator.